Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the first part of what will be a two-event series entitled How Representative is Our Democracy? I am Jody Brummage, Director of Education and Outreach for the Robert C. Byrd Center for Congressional History and Education, and it is my privilege and joy to welcome you tonight for what will be a fantastic and insightful conversation on the Electoral College. Coming out of the historic election of last year, many of us are examining the processes of selecting our public servants with much scrutiny and considering whether these channels of representative democracy are truly representative of the will of the people. This series will illumine this question by exploring the historical precedents that are shaping our contemporary reform conversations. Tonight, we will examine the system established in the Constitution that has, for the past 234 years, determined the next leader of our executive branch, the Electoral College. In 2 weeks' time, we will hear from Dr. Mark Brewer of the University of Maine, who has researched the intersection of partisan politics and the electoral process, and will discuss the electoral reform plan known as ranked choice voting. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to first recognize the people who have made tonight's event a reality. First, I want to express our appreciation to our co-sponsoring organization, the League of Women Voters of Jefferson County. I also want to give my profound thanks to Lynn Yellett, Debbie Royalty, and Marianne Alexander, who comprised our planning committee for tonight's event, for the entire series, that is. Chiefly, I also want to recognize our friends of the Byrd Center, the donors who make all of the Byrd Center's public programs and education initiatives possible. As a nonprofit organization, we rely on the generosity of donors like you and hope that if you are joining us for the first time this evening, you will visit byrdcenter.org/support us and learn how to become a friend and join us in the work of advancing representative democracy. Our speakers tonight are Neal Barkus and Ray Smock. I will introduce them in the order in which they will present their remarks. Neal Barkus is a native West Virginian, having grown up in Charleston. He holds a BA from the University of Virginia and a JD from Washington and Lee School of Law. He practiced in Richmond and Washington, D.C. for 34 years before moving to the Eastern Panhandle. He has served in leadership positions in many nonprofits, including the United Way of the National Capital Area, Friends of Music, and Shenandoah Horse Park. Neal is a member of the League of Women Voters of Jefferson County. He writes a blog called Progressive Panhandle on political and environmental issues and is president of Conservation West Virginia. Neal and his wife Alice live on a small farm outside of Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And we have linked a blog written by Neal on the Electoral College that you can access on the event page for tonight's program. After Neal, Ray Smock will speak. Dr. Ray Smock led the Robert C. Byrd Center for Congressional History and Education as its founding director from 2002 to 2018, and he recently rejoined the staff in 2021 as our interim director. Prior to his tenure at the Byrd Center, Ray served as historian of the United States House of Representatives from the creation of that office in 1983 until 1995. He is past president of the Association of Centers for the Study of Congress, the Society for History in the Federal Government, and the Association for Documentary Editing. He holds the PhD in American History from the University of Maryland, College Park. He is a biographer of Booker T. Washington, co-editor of Congress Investigates, a Critical and Documentary History, and many other works on the history of Congress and the presidency. He has served as historical consultant to the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. A blog written by Ray on his experiences witnessing the Electoral College in action can also be read on the event page for tonight's event. So with that, I want to thank you all again for joining us tonight. I again welcome your questions for our speakers in the chat box. And with that, I am glad to turn it over to Neal Barkus as our first speaker tonight.
Thank you very much, Jody. It's great to see everybody, even in thumbnail size. I realize that I haven't seen many of you for probably over a year. It's a real shame, but we'll get back. I'm delighted to be here and to make this little presentation. It's a topic of interest to me, certainly, and to many other people. But since this presentation is part of a pair that focuses on representative democracy, I'm going to try to stay on message with that. In some ways, our democracy is robust and is working well. For example, the size of the popular vote in the 2020 election was the largest on record. And people, you saw this in Georgia and other places, people are willing to stand in line for long periods and endure physical and financial hardships just to get a chance to vote. But when we're talking about representative democracy, what are we talking about there? I think it has at least 4 components. First, voters have to have the ability to choose a candidate and vote directly for that candidate. Second, all votes cast in an election must be counted in assessing the winner. Third, where each vote has the same weight and value as any other vote. And finally, the candidate with the majority of the votes must be the winner. That sounds reasonable, doesn't it? The sad truth, though, is that each of these components is impaired in our current system, and the culprit is the Electoral College and the winner-take-all system that's in place in 48 out of 50 states. Now, our Constitution is a remarkable document, particularly in the way that it separates branches of government and balances their power, and also in its Bill of Rights. But the Electoral College is not its finest feature. In fact, if the Electoral College were not such a clumsy vehicle for selecting the president, we probably would have avoided the chaos that just took place in January. It wasn't called the Electoral College when the Constitution was adopted, but we have had roughly the same system from the beginning. That's not to say that people have been happy with it by any means. There have been over 700 attempts to eliminate or amend the Electoral College, more than any other provision in the Constitution. Only one of those has succeeded, and that was the 12th Amendment in 1804. How to select the president was argued over in convention nearly the entire summer of 1787, and there were 2 main issues. First, how states could preserve their status and power, and secondly, whether and how slaves in the South would be counted in the voting. Now, the first of these issues, preserving state power, seems odd to us through the lens of representative democracy as we know it today. After all, states are just legal constructs and they surround a group of people. But states don't vote, it's people who vote. And if we were to start fresh today in drafting a constitution, I would bet that we wouldn't be as concerned about the status and power of each state as the original framers were. But you have to understand that they had just lived through 10 years under the Articles of Confederation where each state was a sovereign country. And this new constitution that was being debated in 1787 was asking them to give up that sovereign power, and they were not happy about it and they resisted it. The method that the framers selected for choosing the House of Representatives was direct election by the voters in each congressional district. So it's pretty clear that they were not completely afraid of popular voting. After all, this was supposed to be the people's chamber. But the Senate was completely different. Originally, senators were to be chosen by the legislatures of the various states, not directly by the voters. And this didn't change until 1913. And each state was to have 2 senators regardless of population. The Senate was designed to be the check on excessively passionate and unwise popular voting in the House. Obviously, looking at it from today's point of view, that's not representative democracy. But the 2 senators per state idea was so important to the framers that they actually made it impossible to amend that feature out of the Constitution. In Article 5, which is the amendments article, it says that no state shall be deprived of equal suffrage in the Senate without its consent. In 1787, the difference in population between Virginia, which was the largest state at the time, and Delaware, which was the smallest state, was 13-1. So each voter in Delaware had 13 times the power in the Senate as each voter in Virginia. Today, the difference in population between California, our largest state, and Wyoming, our smallest state, is 70-1. The president and the vice president were to be, and they are today, the only officers that are elected nationwide. So the question was how to elect them. Many of the delegates favored direct election, but most of them did not. Again, it was more of the same small state, large state struggle, but it was also a recognition that the North had more voters than the South did. South Carolina had 250,000 inhabitants at the time, making it among the larger states, but 100,000 of these were slaves who couldn't vote. Finally, as the summer waned, the Constitutional Convention did what many legislatures do. They sent the whole question to a committee. And that committee proposed the Electoral College again, because it had been proposed earlier and defeated. But this time it was reluctantly adopted and the delegates escaped town. So what I'd like to do is to, using each of the features or rules for representative democracy, test the Electoral College on the, what I call the representative democracy meter. So the first rule is voters should be able to vote directly for the candidate of their choice. When we vote in a presidential election, we're not casting a vote for the candidate of our choice, even though the ballot says we are. We're actually voting to empower a slate of electors whose names are not on the ballot and whom we've probably never heard of. Now, the Constitution leaves the method of appointing these electors completely up to the states. And over the years, the states have used different methods for appointing them. First, the governor of the state appointed them, and then they were appointed by the legislature. And then in some cases, they were even elected directly by the voters. But in the early 19th century, we moved to the system that we now have. Electors are committed to cast a vote for the presidential candidate put forward by the political party that nominates them as electors. If that party's candidate gets the most votes, then the state appoints those electors, and they are bound legally to vote for the winning candidate. There is no choice. In some states, they can be fined or even criminally prosecuted if they don't. So why did the framers think that we needed this layer between us and the candidate we wanted to vote for? The idea was this would help screen out unqualified people and demagogues. Electors were supposed to be wise men and with great learning and discernment, could be able to penetrate the character of each of the candidates, whereas the normal voter wouldn't be. And they were afraid that the voters wouldn't be able to learn enough about a particular candidate from another state in particular to recognize a scoundrel. At the time, there were no political parties to organize slates of candidates. And transportation was poor, and mass communications non-existent. But today, both these reasons have disintegrated. Now we're literally bombarded with information about candidates for president. And by the way, electors don't exercise any judgment. They're appointed to act, not to think. And they certainly don't prevent scoundrels from being elected, as the 2016 election clearly showed. So, rule number 2, all votes cast in an election should be counted in determining the winner. Now, a little bit of history here. After Andrew Jackson's election in 1828, most states moved to what we're calling the winner-take-all system, in which the candidate receiving the highest number of votes in the election gets all of the electoral votes for the state, and the second place finisher gets none. This is the system that we now have in almost every state. This is obviously undemocratic. If you're going to have electors in the first place, they should be apportioned, right? Electors should be assigned a certain to a certain segment of the voting, winner and loser. But because they're not, we can, and we often do, get results like we got in Florida in the year 2000. And in that year, George Bush won Florida by a grand total of 537 votes. But he got all 27 electoral votes, and he won the presidency. And we don't have to look at any other state to see the same kind of thing happening. A vote for Joe Biden cast in Shepherdstown in 2020 had no meaning. It was swamped in the sea of red votes elsewhere in the state. But a vote for Donald Trump just 2 miles across the river in Maryland, which is reliably Democratic, was also swamped for the opposite reason. These votes did not count in electing the president. All right, the third rule, each vote should have the same weight and value as any other vote. Putting aside that votes for a losing candidate aren't reflected at all in the electors from a particular state, electoral votes, when counted in the Senate, have a different weight depending on which state they come from. Article 2, Section 1, which is the section of the Constitution that sets up the Electoral College, states that the number of electors each state has is the total of its representatives and its senators. This is an important number, obviously, because the more electors a state has, the more influence it has on the outcome of the election. I suppose you could say that the process is partly democratic, because part of the formula for determining the number of electors is the number of representatives in the House, which is directly elected. But even in the House, there are still problems, democratic problems. And the use of senators in this calculation perpetuates the undemocratic structure of the whole thing. So take, for example, California and Wyoming again. Each congressional district is required to have roughly the same number of people. But no state, even the very smallest ones, can have fewer than one representative. So Wyoming has one member of the House of Representatives for its entire state population of 580,000 people. By contrast, each California congressional district has, on average, 760,000 people. Then, take how skewed the Senate is. Each elector representing a Wyoming Senate seat represents 290,000 people. Each elector representing a California Senate seat represents 19,756,000 people. So it's obvious that a California vote, say for a Democratic presidential candidate, is extremely diluted compared to a Wyoming vote for a Republican candidate. And the fourth rule, the candidate with a majority of votes should be the winner. One big criticism that you hear about the Electoral College is that the winner of the popular vote can still lose the election. Take Hillary Clinton, for example. Not only is it possible, but it's happened several times in the past, and it's likely to happen in the future. Why is that? Where one candidate wins narrow popular vote victories in enough states to achieve the 270 electoral vote majority, but loses the popular vote by a wide margin in other states whose combined electoral votes are less than 270, this result is produced. This happened not only in 2016, but it happened in 1824, 1876, 1888, and 2000. Another problem is that a majority of electoral votes can often come from states where the winning candidate didn't even get a majority of the popular vote. This frequently happens when there are third-party candidates to split up the vote between the two major party candidates. An example of that is Florida, which happened again in 2000. The winner was George Bush, but he didn't command a majority of Florida voters. Instead, he got, I think it's 48.85%. Gore got 48.84%, and Ralph Nader got the rest. And Donald Trump's 2016 electoral vote majority included votes from 7 states where he didn't win a majority of votes: North Carolina, Florida, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Utah. And these states amounted to 107 electoral votes. He was the plurality winner in those states, but he was not the majority winner. So it isn't just that the winner of the national popular vote can lose the election. It's also possible that the winning candidate can't even attract a majority of voters. I'd have to say that this winning candidate is on shaky ground, and he or she certainly couldn't be said to be a Democratic choice. But I left the real nightmare in this system for last. That's what happens when no candidate obtains a majority of electoral votes. Now, we've just seen that certified electoral votes from each state are sent to the Senate and counted. That was the process that was interrupted by the riot on January 6th. But if no candidate has a majority that has 270 votes, the 12th Amendment says that the House of Representatives shall immediately choose the president from a list of the 3 top candidates. And this choice that the House makes doesn't even have to be the candidate with the most votes. This has happened. The presidential election was thrown into the House in 1800 when Jefferson was defeated by John Adams, and then when Andrew Jackson was defeated by John Quincy Adams in 1824. Both times, the winner of that election was determined by horse trading behind the scenes, and the loser howled about fraud for years after the election. And it nearly happened again in 1968 when our friend George Wallace won 10 million votes and 46 electoral votes. So how does the House of Representatives choose from the top 3 electoral vote getters? They do so by a vote in which each state, regardless of size, has only a single vote. This is the ultimate revenge of the small rural states, and completely and totally is contrary to any notion of representative democracy. And it can happen easily when there's a strong third-party candidate. So in closing, we have to recognize the huge risk that the Electoral College creates for the country, and we have to seriously think about how to fix it, either a constitutional amendment or the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which I think Ray's going to talk about in his piece. Something has to give. So thank you very much for your interest and attention, and thanks to the Byrd Center for inviting me. And I would like to leave you with this final image.
Well, thank you, Neal. If this ever goes to court, I'd want you to argue the case. That was an excellent summation, and for those of you who haven't read Neal's earlier piece that's posted on the Byrd Center website, I hope you will do that. It's different from what he talked about tonight, but covers a lot of the same ground, and it's a very good summary of, I think, what a lot of us understand has been a problem in this country, in our Constitution, for a long, long time. And I have had, as a student of the Constitution and American history, a sort of a love-hate relationship with the Electoral College for many years, like a lot of people have. And I'm as I think about it more and more these days, my tendency is toward not liking it. I used to be able to say what Alexander Hamilton said. It's not perfect, but it's at least excellent. He would say that when people would say, why did you create this crazy thing called the Electoral College? And he's, well, it's not perfect, but at least it's excellent. It was never perfect, and it's not excellent. But I'm not going to try to debate Neal's points, which I agree with, but I will take a sort of a counter position in a little bit. We've had 58 presidential elections. You know, that includes all the people who ran more than once. And in 53 of those elections, things worked as a plan. The person who won the most votes also won the most electoral votes. And that has been true in most of our elections, but in the few that Neal touched on, a couple of those deserve a little bit more in-depth look, especially the election of 1876. That election was a total mess. Of course, it's coming, you know, this is just a dozen years or so after the Civil War. The South is still occupied by federal troops. A lot of them have been withdrawn, but in several states, they're still there, in Louisiana, in South Carolina, in Florida. And the fact that 3 states, actually Oregon had a disputed electoral ballot too, but that was pretty quickly done away with. What you had was conflicting parties that claimed they represented the state in these states, and so you didn't have certified electoral votes coming out of 3 states. You had them contested, and this threw a monkey wrench into the works like we hadn't seen before. It wasn't a simple matter of the House of Representatives trying to then elect if there was nobody in the majority. This was you couldn't even determine who won the votes, whose electoral votes you were going to count. So easy quilt system was developed to deal with that election. A federal commission composed of 5 House members, 5 senators, and 5 Supreme Court justices. This was unprecedented. We'd never had anything like that to solve a presidential election before, and it was supposed to be fair and balanced. You had 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 independent. The independent dropped out for health reasons, and a Republican came in. So it was a straight line vote after that. It was 8-7 in the commission, but it was more complicated than that. This was a case where the president was elected not by representative democracy by any stretch of the imagination, even under the Constitution. It was the backroom deals. It was deciding that both parties would like to see the Civil War, the Reconstruction period after the Civil War ended, withdrawal of the federal troops. Some people were negotiating for Southern railroads to be built. You had Republicans who went south, carpetbaggers and others who went south to make a fortune after the Civil War. You had black voters voting for the first time in large numbers. We forget how many offices were held by African Americans in that during that period. And so all of that was swept away. So it wasn't just a bad presidential election. It was the end of Reconstruction. It was the beginning of the end of all the advancements of the three civil rights, the three constitutional amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments were basically thrown out the window. African Americans who were largely supporting the Republican Party in those days, the party of Lincoln that freed the slaves, they were left hanging in the wind. And so the Republican won that election, Rutherford B. Hayes, even though Tilden, the former governor of New York, the Democrat, had won 90,000 more popular votes. And the election was decided just on the basis of one electoral vote in the end. The 20 disputed votes that had Rutherford B. Hayes behind were all awarded to him, and he ended up winning 185 to 184. So, but if you ever want to look at the worst possible scenario for an election that had the worst possible consequences for the country, that would be the one. But Neal mentioned, of course, obviously Bush v. Gore, and that's a recent example of another bad decision where both parties ended up running to the courts to figure out what to do about Florida. The election, Gore had Florida was going to be decided. Gore had won New Mexico by 353 votes, I think it was. So some of these states were so tight. And so Florida's electoral votes would put George Bush over if they went to him, which is the way it turned out. But it went to the Supreme Court. I was one of those that was outside the court at that time, carrying signs protesting that this is an election that should be settled by the House of Representatives, and according to the Constitution. But again, both parties went to the courts, and by a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court stopped the vote count in Florida that could have given it to Al Gore. And it was a huge mess all around. And again, Gore won the popular vote, but he lost in the Electoral College by the votes of the state of Florida. And certainly the 2016 election was the most lopsided in terms of the electoral vote, or in terms of the popular vote. Hillary Clinton won almost 3 million votes more than Donald Trump. But there we had those so-called battleground states. We now have battleground states where these things, a very small percentage win is enough to give you the Electoral College votes. And it doesn't have anything to do with the total votes. And then we saw now in this year, we had an election where there has never been a candidate that won a greater plurality of the votes by more than 7 million ballots than Biden did. And he won substantially in the Electoral College. It wasn't close in the Electoral College. And yet, the drumbeat of a demagogue that for 4 years, just rallied people unmercifully against the system, led to a normal, peaceful counting of the electoral ballots turned into an insurrection and a riot. And now there's even talk of that when Joe Biden comes in to give us his, he won't be the State of the Union, but it'll be his first appearance before the House of Representatives in a joint meeting. that there's talk of some radicals trying to blow the Capitol up. So how far have we gone from a peaceful election? And how have we found ways to disturb even the electoral process? The idea that someone would rally millions of people to think that they could actually overturn an election after all 50 states had certified the elections and had 60 lawsuits challenging some of them, and all those lawsuits were beaten back, the Supreme Court, and yet they somehow, Donald Trump convinced a lot of people that this was the most fraudulent election in American history. So we're in uncharted territory now, whether we have a direct election or whether we have continue with the Electoral College. We have seen a total disruption and a total lack of understanding of how the process is supposed to work. And this threatens the stability of the entire country. So we do have to do something very quickly, whether it's changing the Electoral College, which I don't think is going to be easy, and it never has been. It's been, as Neal pointed out, it's been 700 times it's been talked about. But now we've got a system that goes around that, and it's an idea called the National Compact. And this is an idea that's been around for 15 years or more now. And 15 states out of the 50, 15 states have agreed to its terms, but we're still a long way from having that happen. The National Compact says that each state will agree to accept the winner of the majority of votes nationally, regardless of whether that candidate won the state itself. And this is a way to get around the Electoral College and still have the Electoral College there. In other words, the electoral votes would still be there, but they would be guaranteed to go to the national winner. And this was an idea that languished for a number of years and never really got anywhere. But then it was John W. Anderson who pushed it in Illinois. That was the first big state to jump on board. California came on a few years later. So now they have 165 electoral votes. They got to get to 270, a number of states to agree to this. And then, of course, the problem becomes, is this constitutional? And there's bound to be constitutional challenges to any national compact. And now next week, of course, or in the next session, you're going to hear from Mark Brewer about this new idea called ranked choice voting. And I don't know much about that, and I'm not even going to venture into it. I've followed it just in the newspapers and things like that. So I have no understanding of it, but Mark Brewer does. He's a political scientist in Maine, and Maine has adopted this plan. And so you'll hear about that next time. I don't want to talk about that now, other than to suggest that it is something we should look at, and I need to learn more about it. And I'm looking forward to hearing what Mark has to say in our next session. So let me just close by saying, direct election in a national vote sounds simple. It sounds direct. It sounds very democratic. But here's the rub. What do you do if there is a close election in that national election? And it's very, very tight. And someone says, well, there might have been fraud. And in 1960, and Nixon and Kennedy, there were 69 million votes cast. But the difference in the national vote was only 118,000. That's a small percentage of 69 million. So what is the cutoff date? What would you have? How much would you have to win by before you could say it was a solid win without someone challenging corruption in some states And so you'd have the same kind of problem you have with the Electoral College if it's close and if someone challenges it. And so you'd have to have a machinery set up for that. Right now, if you have a machinery, it's in the state, where each state, or maybe part of the state, or part of the thing, like in Florida in 2000, it was just part of the state that was really contested. And so which precincts, if there's a national election and it's very tight, which precincts do you look at? There's 174,000 precincts. Do you recount the whole thing? So I don't have an answer to this. I'm just raising this as something for us to think about. A direct election that's close still has problems that have to be resolved about how that would be resolved. And so I think with this kind of background, I hope we'll just turn it open now for discussion and to hear your questions and your comments about this process. So turn it back to Jody.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ray, and thank you, Neal. So as I see a few questions start popping into the chat box, I'm going to invite everyone to please enter your questions for Neal or Ray in the chat box, and I'll pass them on to them. I'd like to begin by asking the question, if we go back to the framing period, was there a precedent that the framers were looking to in designing this system, or did it totally grow out of the sort of the disparate demands of the 13 colonies? Were they looking to something that already existed somewhere else?
Are you asking that to one or both of us?
Either one, either who would like to address it.
You want to go take that, Neal, or you want me to? Go ahead.
Well, no, I thought maybe you would, Ray. But
okay, I'll do it.
No, I'm only joking, Ray.
Yeah.
I really, I think that there was something that they were looking to. It wasn't quite like this. The gentleman who really put this whole idea together was James Wilson, who was a very smart lawyer, a representative from Pennsylvania, probably the most important member of the Constitutional Convention that nobody's ever heard of. And he was the guy who he was actually a proponent of direct election, but when he saw that wasn't going to work, he came up with this idea for an electoral college. And I seem to remember that there was something that he was basing that on, but it wasn't something widespread. So I'm sorry, that's all I can tell you.
And that is in fact the case. The American government was a unique experiment, and I would hope that we are still an experimental people. And something that worked for the 1780s and 90s doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for us. One of the things that they didn't think about at all was political parties. I mean, they knew about factions, and they were perfectly aware that and they were engaged in basically party politics, but it wasn't organized the way it became. They knew nothing about computers, and in modern elections, and the thing we have to worry about now is when these people that are working for the campaigns, they go out into some of these communities. They're going right down. Used to be you had to go by county, then zip code, like that. But now we're getting to people right on their own address on their own computer, and we know how they're reacting. And if you could plan that carefully enough, you can go into a state and say, well, we only got to win this state by, a couple of hundred votes, and then it'll work in the Electoral College for us. And that's exactly the model that Donald Trump won on. He won by less than 1% of the vote in about 5 states. But that was enough to give him a substantial win in the Electoral College. So, and the way we go at it, I mean, we all watched John Kornacki perhaps, and how he goes to the big board. Well, you've got a lot of really smart people running these campaigns who go to the big board, and they're going to private polls. that are conducted. They know exactly where they need to target these votes. So it's not, the pressure is put on people in ways that was never put on people in early elections, when you basically had a newspaper and maybe two newspapers in a town, one Republican, one Democrat, and you'd have to sort of duke it out. It's a lot different in this world today.
Excellent. Well, so a question just showed up in the chat box, and it actually follows up on one that I had. And admittedly, this last election was the first time that I had noticed that two states, Maine and Nebraska, split their electoral votes. They're not winner, or they don't all go to the majority candidate. And so, but there's a question in the chat box here that says, what would it take to make all states use that method of counting their electoral votes? And is that, potentially a way of reforming the Electoral College to be more reflective of the actual vote totals?
Neal?
Yeah. So each state is authorized by the Constitution to determine these questions completely on their own. So in New Hampshire, for example, I'm sorry, it's in Maine, they have two, let me see if I can get this right. Is it 2, Ray, or 3 congressional districts in Maine? I think it's 2.
Mm-hmm.
So they
Well,
have.
I think it's 3. We got Lisa Welch is on, but she could correct us on this. I think she's got a place in Maine, but I think
Okay.
it's 3.
There are 2.
Is it 2?
It's
okay.
2.
I thought it was 3.
So,
I thought it was 2-1 in this last election, but maybe not.
So I think what I'm sorry, go ahead. I think what happens in Maine is that they're split by congressional district, so that if I think this actually happened, one congressional district went for Trump and the other one went for Biden, so they split those two, and then the remaining electoral vote. No, I guess there's two additional electoral votes. There's a total of 4, and if there's 2 congressional districts, then there's 2 senators, so there'd be 4. And the electors for the 2 senators went to the winner of the popular vote for the entire state. Nebraska's situation is very similar to that. I think it might even be the same. But if you're asking what would it take for everybody to do that, it would take an amazing exercise in herding cats, because every state would have to do it, have to find the political will to do it for each of its, each state. It's hardly possible.
But the operational thing is the Constitution gives great latitude to the states to determine how they set up their election laws. I mean, we have federal election laws now, of course, and but the states really run the elections. Right now we don't have a national election for president, and so any direct election of presidents would be a national election that would have perhaps different kinds of machinery. Right now we have 50 state elections that determine this national office. So any changes in a system that was direct election of a president by the majority of the votes would change a lot of laws as well in each state, would have to change them.
So Colin has asked, it says it seems that the Electoral College gives people an excuse not to vote because they feel their vote won't really count. And doesn't this act as a suppressant of the vote?
I think it does for those people who don't understand the system, or perhaps want other excuses for not voting. Maybe we should adopt what they did in Australia, although Australia is now rethinking it in a lot of ways. But back in the 1920s, in some parts of Australia, and then by the 1940s, you were required to vote, and if you didn't vote, you were fined. I think it was like $127 in Australian dollars. So the idea there was that this gets everybody out, and the beauty thing they said was that that the candidates, knowing that they had to appeal to a broad spectrum, not just to a political base, they campaigned differently, and they campaigned on issues more broadly. Well, I'm not suggesting we adopt the Australian system. In fact, some of the things I've read about it recently says in some places that's kind of falling apart. It doesn't seem to work as well as they thought. But the fact that so many people voted in this last election during a pandemic suggests to me that without an awful lot of work, we can encourage more voters to get out in these important elections. It was while we talk about we're talking about a failure of our system right now, but the other thing you look at is the fact that many people voted in this important election, and the election itself was done with great honesty, and it withstood an onslaught of lawsuits like no other election in our history. And even the insurrection at the Capitol, as bad as it was, and it's horrendous, and we've got to do something about that. The fact that it disrupted the process of democracy only 5 hours or 8 hours, there's some resilience here that I find encouraging.
There was a question earlier that said, as per Cokie Roberts, are there regional issues to not having a national election, where smaller demographic issues will no longer have to be addressed at some point in the process? So I'm guessing the question is asking, is there, particular advantages to our present system outside of perhaps the elements of it that can lead to, the end result not reflecting the popular vote?
You want to take that?
Well,
Neal?
I would say, yes, I guess my reaction to that is that, sure, smaller states have a lot more power than they would otherwise have under this system. And so if you were to propose getting rid of the Electoral College in the way that it's constructed, you might get some pushback from the smaller states who would take the same position that smaller states did when the Constitution was being put together in the beginning. So West Virginia, for example, has 5 electoral votes. That's not a lot as things go, but that's a considerable number given our state population. So there are regional issues, and I think you could predict them.
Let me add to that we are a republic composed of states, United States of America. It's true, as Neal said, states don't vote, people vote. But our whole system of laws and governance and our Constitution is predicated on the concept that there is a federal government, but there's also state governments. And of course, we are in a struggle as a nation over the very idea of whether we should have a strong central government. And this is something that founders debated as well, not the same way we're doing it today. But who does have supremacy? The federal laws supersede state laws. So in that sense, the federal government is superior. But we have a federal system, and how does that federal system stand up? How do we respect the states if we go to simply where one man, one woman, one vote? It does something to federalism. I'm not sure exactly what, but it does eliminate the concept of a state because it's a federal election, and the small states have a smaller number of votes. And if you're a candidate, I would say, where are you going to go for your votes? You're going to go to the big states that have the most population, because you don't care about regions anymore. You care about numbers.
Well, I would like to respond to that briefly, because I read a piece just in preparation for this presentation that debunked that particular point of view. And it did so by pointing out that even the large states like California and New York and Texas don't get a whole lot of attention from the national presidential candidates. An overwhelming number of events, large proportion of events, campaign events, are held in swing states. So it's not so much that candidates would spend all their time in California, where there are a lot of electoral votes, because it's pretty clear which candidate's going to get those. They spend their time in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin.
I had a question, and Neal, you mentioned this early in your remarks. You said that the Electoral College is, the basic idea was set down in the Constitution, but it was largely redefined by the 12th Amendment. Wonder if you could speak a little bit more to what the 12th Amendment actually is, what it did to that process, and perhaps the conditions that brought it about.
Well, the best way to do that is to remember what happened in the election of 1800. At that time, the original Constitution said that each elector had 2 votes, and he could vote for whomever he wanted, but the result of the election was that the person who got the most electoral votes of all would be the president, and the person who got the second most would be the vice president. So in the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson and was the presidential candidate for what were called the Democratic Republicans, and Aaron Burr was his vice president. And he was being opposed by the Federalist John Adams. So what happened was Jefferson, I think, got 79 electoral votes, but every single elector who voted for Jefferson also voted for Burr. And there was a tie, a completely unexpected tie, of the president and the vice president on the same ticket. Adams got fewer votes. So this had to be worked out in some fashion, and it went through a gazillion different ballots. And finally, Alexander Hamilton intervened. He didn't like Jefferson a bit, but he really hated Aaron Burr. And so what he did was he threw the election to John Adams. So when Jefferson took office in 1800, they realized something had to be fixed. And the amendment was actually that there had to be separate ballots for president and vice president. As before, as I said, it was a single ballot, and whoever got the most was the president, and the second most was the vice president. So they switched and made it into separate ballots for president and vice president. And I think there were some other significant changes that maybe Ray can address.
That's the main thing. It was that's the purpose of the 12th Amendment, was to separate those 2 elections, as you described.
So there's a question, and before I ask this one, I'll kind of say last call for questions from our audience. Please enter them in the chat box if you have them now. But there is a question here that speaks a little bit to sort of Congress's role, the legislative branch's role in all of this. And of course, the Electoral College does put quite a lot of power in the hands of the legislative branch when it comes to the selection of the president, as you've already explained, occurred in 1876. So are there rules of the House and the Senate that impact this process? And specifically, the question mentions the filibuster, and something that's being debated right now. Do those rules have an impact on the Electoral College process as it plays out?
I don't think so. Not directly in any way. The process of what happens when Congress finally gets. Of course, the founding fathers debated whether or not, maybe the House of Representatives should elect the president. I mean, that was one of the options, and of course, it became only in the case where no one gets a majority of the votes, then the House decides, with each state having one vote, as Neal described earlier. So there is a provision for the House to elect the President of the United States, but it's never quite worked out that simply. But I don't see where some of these other devices that are contentious and that in impact on representative democracy, the dilatory tactics, the filibuster being the most supreme of those, whether that I can't see where that has any impact on the electoral process directly.
There was one last question that popped up here, and it said, to make the Republic more representative, what would happen to the Electoral College if U.S. territories currently represented by delegates in Congress had electors in the Electoral College? Thinking about D.C., the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the other U.S. territories.
D.C. does have 3 electors, but the others don't.
And if the others had them right now, they would vote Democratic. So if there was a Republican administration, they would be against that. And if it was if the Democratic administration, they would probably push it. This has been one of the problems of reforming the Electoral College since day one. First of all, it's a constitutional amendment, and that's always a challenge. We haven't had that many. And the second being that the party that's usually in power at the time that this is happening is against changing the Electoral College because they got into power with it. And so we just haven't figured out a good way to address this with reasonable debate or some kind of change. And I think ultimately it's going to take a constitutional amendment, and we may get to that point, although we'll see what happens with this compact, national compact, which is probably the best end around way to have the Electoral College still function, but to have the states to say it's going to be based on the national winner. That's an interesting idea. Whether it stands up in the courts is another question, as I said earlier. But I still think that's the best chance. Although maybe you'll be convinced at the next program that ranked choice, where you rank 2 or 3 choices, and if the first doesn't get the majority, well, you keep working up the ladder until one of your candidates gets the majority. So that's another whole sort of whack-a-mole scheme, as far as I can tell right now. But I'm willing to learn more about that one.
Well, we've gotten several comments of gratitude and compliments to our speakers, and we certainly do appreciate, Ray and Neal, your remarks, your experiences, and the information that you've shared with us tonight. I do want to say before we sign off that this is, as I mentioned at the beginning, the first of a 2-part series. As has been mentioned a couple times, our next program will feature Dr. Mark Brewer, Professor of Political Science from the University of Maine. That event will take place on Wednesday, March 10th, 2021 at 7 p.m. here on Zoom again. And you can sign up for that event at the same place that you signed up for this event. And I'll also ask and invite you to check out our event page for this. You can get there just by going to byrdcenter.org and on our homepage, clicking How Representative is Our Democracy. There are resources on that page from Neal and Ray that they have shared for diving into the Electoral College deeper and learning even more about it. And you can find that on that page. You can also visit that page to view some informational resources about ranked choice voting. And I encourage you to do that so that you can bring your questions for Dr. Mark Brewer at our event on March 10th. So with that, I want to thank you all again for joining us tonight. Thank you, Ray and Neal, so much, and I hope that you all have a wonderful evening.